Hi, in this video I'm going to run through some of the tricky questions from the mock exam. We actually used last year's paper from May 2013, so this was a real test for you. So question 1 didn't present many difficulties to you. Keyword is obviously main, and it's the objectives of businesses or firms. And although there's some correct economics in there, D is the correct answer. Question 2 was slightly trickier because it's not the usual PPF that we're looking at, so you just need to work it out logically. In this question you might use the elimination technique. So the first thing to say is this is a production possibility frontier. So therefore it tells us nothing about demand. Secondly, along any straight line PPF there's no change in the opportunity cost, so we can rule out option D as well. So when you see an increase in the relative output of one good in relation to the other, it tells us that there is an improvement in the productivity of producing that good. That means that you can get more of that good for the resources that you're putting in. For question 3, I've just drawn a simple diagram by the side. The question is asking me about the price elasticity of supply of most goods, so it's asking me about the supply curve. Because this relationship is a positive relationship, the answer is D. Question 4 was difficult because you're presented with a lot of information on the screen. So the first thing to do would probably be to cover them up and have a look at the question. So we want negative externalities in consumption and production. So usually we wouldn't expect to see all 4 curves on the graph, so break it down logically. Negative externalities in production is our standard pollution example, where the marginal social costs are higher than the marginal private costs. The market's not concerned about those external costs. So looking at the options, we can immediately rule out B and D. Next, negative externalities in consumption. We're now operating around the benefit curves, and this is effectively something like a demerit good, where the market results in an overconsumption. So looking at the 2 options, the marginal social benefit is going to be lower than the marginal private benefit, so the answer is C. It's a difficult question because you had to go through several decisions in order to reach the answer. Question 7, concept of scarcity. So because of scarcity, we've got some distractors here. The answer is individuals have to make choices in order to maximise their own utility. Question 8 requires a bit of careful reading, and I would always focus on the keywords in the question. So it tells us here something is happening with income. and as a result demand for two different products is shifting. So the only conclusions we can draw are about income elasticity. So we can eliminate C and we can eliminate D. You have to be careful with the terminology here because statements A and B look very, very similar. But what it tells us is as incomes go up, there's a response in terms of demand. So if income rises and there's a fall in the demand for UK holidays, they must be inferior goods. So this is another slightly tricky question which requires you to make deductions from the statements. So it talks about a subsidy of social housing or council housing. Social housing is targeted to people on low incomes. Again, I'd use the elimination technique here. So there's no missing market in housing, and social housing does not meet the criteria of being a public good. Subsidising low-cost housing, although it would seem to reduce inequality in some ways, doesn't affect the distribution of wealth. As to an economist, wealth is a stock of assets, and social housing does not add to people's assets, so therefore the answer is A. The question 12 is a slightly tricky question, but it's an application of the tax diagram. So this is the market for cigarettes, and therefore the imposition of the tax shifts the supply curve from S1 to S2, and therefore we move from one equilibrium quantity to another equilibrium quantity. The total amount of tax is this rectangle here, but it's the consumer that experiences the biggest increase in the price. So this smaller rectangle, which I'm trying to shade in blue, is the amount that the consumer will pay. So how do we use the numbers? Well, the consumer's paying between £6 and £9, so the consumer's paying an extra £3 per unit, multiplied by the 50 units, so the consumer's actually picking up £150 of the tax revenue, so therefore the answer's A. Now this is a twist on a previous question, because usually the examiner links medium of exchange to specialisation and division of labour, and they've done that, but this time they've flipped it over. So money is used as a medium of exchange. What that should do in every society is increase the amount of trade that's likely to happen, because producers don't have to spend time, waste time, finding other producers with the same products that they want to swap. So just be careful when you see this question because it could be worded differently from previous exam papers. First thing I would do with this question is simply look at the data and by the side of it just put a little arrow, so the price of oranges is going down, apples is going down, pears is going down, and grapes is going down between the 2 years. Okay, so which of the following is supported by the data? Well, first of all, this is simply telling us about the world price of these commodities, so we don't know anything about earnings, because in order to work out earnings we need to have price multiplied by quantity. The second one I can eliminate is option C, because in order to work out price elasticity of demand I need to have information about percentage change in price, but also information about percentage change in quantity, and I can't see that. Next I'm going to eliminate B, because it tells us that the price of apples is tending to fall. Well, in a market economy, if the price of a product is falling, it will do the opposite. It will discourage apple growers to increase their output. So I'm going to eliminate option B. So the answer is D, and that's a piece of revision that's worth following up. Question 15, simple definition with an example. So it's talking about the factory, which is technical, and the advertising, which is marketing. A. Question 16 is to do with market failure again, and we're looking for misallocation of resources. So the answer is C. In question 17 we're looking for the negative side of a monopoly. Well, if we look at the options, the negative of a monopoly is that it can charge higher prices than if it was under conditions of competition. So this scenario is showing us that there are positive benefits in production because we've got a shift of the cost curves. The government policy that would attempt to increase the output is going to be a subsidy rather than a tax, so we can eliminate B and D. And now at the new equilibrium, which is this point that I've indicated here, the level of the subsidy is the vertical distance, and therefore the answer is FH, which is the same as that vertical distance, so the answer is A. Question 19 requires you to know the link between price elasticity of demand and total revenue. So first of all, we notice that there's relatively inelastic demand. So if the price of the product increases by 10%, the revenue will go up, but because it's a small response, it's relatively inelastic, it's going to rise by less than that 10%. In fact, in this instance, it's only going to increase by 5%. Question 21 is about knowing your elasticities accurately. What you should remember is an inferior good is linked to income elasticity of demand. So if we look at the options, the answer is D. 21 was another hard one. In economics we use index numbers to show changes in prices, commonly for prices of goods. So in this example we're looking at the average price of clothing. If we look at the way the index moves, there's an increase, there's an increase, there's a decrease, and there's an increase. Key concept the examiner's testing here is the idea of a percentage change, but it's a bit of a trick question. The answer to this one is B, but you need to read the question carefully, because what it's saying is you're starting from 125 and working backwards to 100. So the difference is 25, but the starting value, the original value that you're being asked to use, is 125. So for that reason, the answer is 20%. Watch out for those sorts of questions. Question 22 is about another market failure, which is to do with immobility of factors. In this example, if a worker is unwilling to change their jobs, then by definition they're immobile. Question 23, you should be looking out for keywords that relate to market failure. Market failure is to do with externalities. Remember, we would call this a market failure because the benefits are being ignored. So market failure isn't always negative, it can also be positive, resulting in a underconsumption. 24 is another market failure. So when negative externalities are being produced, we're going to get a shift to the left of the cost curve. So in order to deal with that, the government's going to impose a tax, and the tax is the vertical distance between the two supply curves at that level of output. So therefore the answer is B. And the final question, question 25, is about government failure rather than market failure. So the government is trying to reduce carbon emissions, and they're using the policy of pollution permits to do this. Well, one of the weaknesses of the pollution permit system can often be the lack of strict limits, so therefore the answer here is C.